The way we take care of ourselves is ever evolving.
And what we know for sure is that our mind and spirit are linked to our physical body.
And that our wellness seems to extend into our communities and the planet we all share.
It is very, very clear that wellness is interconnected.
We love spending time with you to explore and practice the breakthroughs, the insights, and the passions of incredible people helping us all see the world in a whole new light.
This is Health Gig.
Doro and I are so excited about today's guest. His name is Jeff Krasno, and he's the founder and CEO of Commune.
We've really been looking forward to this conversation, and so welcome to Health Gig, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to connect with you and just the amazing community that you've built. I know what it's like to build a community, and it takes a lot of persistence. So well done, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. We want to start sort of at the beginning and how you got into health and wellness. You say you went from wealth and wellness to health and wellness, which is hilarious. So let's begin there.
I was a wayward musician for most of my youth, and my dad and my brother are musicians. My grandfather quit cardiology to become a professional gypsy violinist at age 57, which had us all scratching our chins a little bit. He decided to do what he loved. And that was really most of my peripatetic youth, was playing music. And then subsequently I started a record label and a management company.
Oh, wow.
And we had artists traveling around the world, and it was a wonderful, wonderful time in my life. In many ways, it was, I got to meet fantastic, brilliant, virtuoso musicians and be on tour with a lot of really inspiring people.
Can you tell us like who?
Yeah, tell us who.
Sure.
Tell us who,
like Herbie Hancock, the legendary jazz pianist, taught me how to meditate. So that was a good story.
Oh, yeah.
So we were on tour a little with him. He's a Buddhist, and he follows the Nichiren tradition. And prior to every gig, he would engage in this meditation, this mantra chanting practice that is Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. Anyway, and he's reading out of Buddhist scripture, but it's essentially repeating that mantra over and over again. And he would invite anyone that was willing back into his inner sanctum in the green room to meditate with him. And that was really my first introduction to meditation. And still every morning when I hop into my little barrel sauna, I chant Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. There's a literal Sanskrit transliteration to that, which is like the blooming of the flower of the lotus or something like that. But it's actually not meant to be literal at all. It's actually, you just lose yourself in the vibrations and you inhabit that present moment. That was interesting, but I will say that primarily the business of the music industry is done between 9 and 5, and I'm talking about 9 p.m. and 5 a.m.
Yeah.
That lends itself to all sorts of vice and pleasures of the flesh, mostly just, as one, I don't probably need to enumerate them. And then also just a tremendous amount of travel and grind. And that's really what punctuated my life. And I was a young person, so, my body was fairly resilient and could bounce back. I was starting to develop the early presentations of, many of the more severe acute symptoms that later reared their head. I started to develop, a lot of kind of visceral adiposity, kind of fat around the middle. I had early chronic fatigue, some brain fog. I was certainly insomniatic because my hours were so irregular. I was going to Japan a lot, and I was going to Europe a lot. And then, these other sorts of esoteric symptoms of like little bumps on the back of my neck or little moles growing in my armpits and things like that I later discovered were kind of early symptoms of metabolic dysfunction and diabetes, but I'm getting ahead of myself a tiny bit. So my office was based in Lower Manhattan in Tribeca, right in the financial district there, and 9/11 happened. And my office was in the tiny little perimeter, like 2 blocks north of the World Trade Center. Now, that happened in the morning time, and I wasn't up yet, of course, given my hours at that point. So I wasn't in my office, but I couldn't access the office for a number of months. And I lived in Brooklyn Heights, which was just over the water, was susceptible to a lot of the toxic air and pollutants that happened in the alpenglow of that event. But more apt to the story here is that my wife of we've been together for 36 years now.
College sweethearts? You guys met in college?
College sweethearts, yeah. I've been with her for 36.
Neat.
She's been with me for 35, and that's a whole other podcast that we can have at some point. But let's just say chivalry was not dead in those days. And she had an ability to sail 1,000 ships. So she did something quite extraordinary, kind of in the aftermath of 9/11, is right above my office, right there at the World Trade Center, she opened a yoga studio. Everyone had basically flown the coop from my building. It was different creatives and photographers, et cetera. Everyone left New York. They went to Woodstock. They went to these other places. And so there was a lot of available real estate down in Lower Manhattan, minus the towers. She decided to open what she called Kula Yoga Project. And Kula translates in Sanskrit as intentional community. Mind you, this was no Equinox. This was not in the era of like fancy Tony yoga studios on every corner. This was a one-room, rickety studio with a radiator that hissed and a bathroom that was like a bread box. You had to like climb up these cockeyed lime green stairs to get there. And you had to literally go through my office to get up to it. This sanctuary became a refuge place, a community center for healing. A lot of people associate Lower Manhattan with the financial district, et cetera, but it was actually very, very local, and there was a lot of residential real estate down there. And so these kind of beleaguered denizens, mostly women, that were going through a tremendous amount of grief, found their way to Kula and got on their mats and started to chant and started to move. And then after class, and this is where really I got a front row seat to witness the power of movement and community to heal. I would see these people emerge from class drenched in sweat, open-hearted, open-minded, like collapsed on this tiny little funky futon and sharing stories and laughing and crying and holding each other and just telling the story. It's very moving even now. I was like, this is it. I love music and I love bringing people together around music, but I so deeply resonated with what was happening there in my wife's little studio. I started following her along, as I'm apt to do, in the name of yoga on many bumpy trips to Costa Rica and go to these far-flung retreat centers. There I'd be, and there'd be, 30 women and 2 gay guys and me, generally, to be honest with you. And we'd be living this incredibly spirited, vital life, like waking with the sun, meditation, moving, doing yoga, getting out into the surf, cooking together, telling stories. But it was also not sanctimonious, really, or mawkish. Like at night, we'd play music and we'd have just enough wine, to be healthy, and people would be off in the bushes in illicit hookups or whatever. It was fun, and it was like vital and vibrant. And somewhere far in the Osa Peninsula in Costa Rica in 2007 or 8, I had this idea, which in retrospect was very male, which was like, how do I scale this idea? And I had been backstage at every significant festival, Bonnaroo and Lollapalooza and Austin City Limits. That was kind of my stomping ground. So I knew how to produce large-scale things, and it wasn't daunting to me. And I understood really great look and feel as it pertained to design and art. And I said, hey, what if we created the world's largest yoga retreat, and we put it in a place that was more accessible, and we made the price point more accessible, and we gathered in the same way Lollapalooza gathers Radiohead and Coldplay and Dave Matthews. We would gather all the biggest names in the world of health and wellness, put them under literally a tent or 12, and create this thing that I eventually called Wanderlust. This was the experiment. This was the project that consumed 10 years of my life and connected me with everyone that I ever loved and respected, and all the authors that I read, and everyone that had bent the arc of my life. And it was an incredible experience for me. We had 3 daughters during that period, and we were just a bunch of gypsies, like traveling from festival to festival. I mean, running them, but traveling to them nonetheless. By 2016, we had 68 festivals in 20 countries.
Wow.
And these were not like 50-person things in the backyard. This was like four-walling, massive ski resorts, and anywhere between 3,000 to 10,000 people per day. And now had them on more weekends than I could actually physically go to because they were all over the world. And of course, to do this, to execute that, requires a lot of capital and really just an endless amount of blood, sweat, and tears. And yes, I was engaged in a project that was dedicated to well-being, but I found myself to be very, very unwell. And you hinted at this before, but my journeys and my exploits in health and wellness turned into a reality of wealth and wellness. I spent most of my time chasing sponsorship dollars and in corporate board meetings, etc. And I was living like, coffee to wine, and couldn't sleep and was stressed out all the time with the bad chronic stress. This is the rub, really, is that all of these things like brain fog and chronic fatigue and a little extra adiposity and some tiny little man boobs and whatever, all these things are so boring and prosaic and normal now that essentially we have accepted what is abnormal as normal. I mean, nobody had those precursors to chronic disease hundreds of years ago, and certainly not in our hunter-gatherer days. Nobody had diabetes, or really the obesity rates were essentially non-existent. Nobody had dementia, Alzheimer's. Nobody had PCOS. There was no infertility problem. All of those conditions that I just mentioned, they are not bugs in the system. This is what I learned. They are the expected and normal results of our Paleolithic genome trying to just cope with our lifestyle, the way that we live. And I was in the center of that nightmare and eventually was diagnosed with diabetes. That was a wake-up call. I started to wear this continuous glucose monitor on my tricep. It gave me a dashboard into my health, into my metabolic health. And there I was at 125 milligrams per deciliter, fasting glucose levels. That's the very highest edge of prediabetes. And I would have these massive spikes into the mid 200s. I was insulin resistant, and that was leading to all sorts of different issues, from inflammation in my body to levels of obesity and visceral and ectopic fat that I talked about, and then, some other insults to my vanity, which of course isn't, something too. But I was, on my way towards being another statistic in the world of heart disease and dementia, et cetera. I had to really get my act together. I had to understand why I was living in this nightmare, and all of the elements that contribute to what I call sort of our obsession with the Big Macs, with the big modern American conveniences. I don't mean just the burger that you buy at the Evil M, but all of the modern conveniences that we so love to luxuriate in, but that are so good at hijacking our biology, and they're really making us sick. And I had to understand what those were and then start to unravel it.
So how did you start? What did you do?
I never do it the easy way. I started this business really around, in some ways, my own infirmity. I realized that I was like so many other people. In a way, I will be the least extraordinary person you guys interview. It's just I'm so ordinary. And unfortunately, what is so ordinary is all of that constellation of diseases that I talk about. I decided to build this thing called Commune, which really became kind of the master class of well-being. But I started to interview functional medicine doctors and precision medicine doctors, everyone from Mark Hyman to Jeffrey Bland and Sarah Gottfried and Casey Means and Kara Fitzgerald. I started to try to understand what the root causes of these chronic conditions, these subjective conditions that I was feeling, and then the diseases that are actually downstream from there. So I started to make online courses with all of these folks. I started to interview them for my Commune podcast, and I built a 10-acre retreat center in Topanga, which is near Los Angeles in the Santa Monica Mountains. It's kind of a hippie haven. We build yoga shalas and meditation perches and cabins everywhere. And we started to invite these teachers and doctors to come and teach there. I basically jumped in to my own petri dish and did, a tremendous amount of me-search and became sort of an N of one experiment to kind of unravel the artifacts of modern comfort, of modern ease, of modern convenience. And I started to adopt a series of inconvenient, uncomfortable protocols, which I, later have coined as good stress. But this, consisted of everything from really taking a look at how I was consuming food, what I was consuming, how often I was consuming, when I was consuming, and start to ask the question, well, how did I evolve? Like, what is my body actually engineered to eat? And when is it engineered to eat? And really asking those root questions and then trying to adopt a set of behaviors and protocols that actually aligned with how I evolved, with what my genome says I should do, versus the modern way of doing it. There's 4 meals a day. If you go to Denny's, I ended up at Denny's randomly, like 4 years ago. It's not a place I normally go, as you can imagine. And I looked up at the sandwich board, the little placard that they have on the wall there, and it was like breakfast, served all day, thank God, lunch, dinner, and then there was a 4th meal of the day, late night. I was like, oh my God, we just never stop eating. So this, made me really look at like modern industrial agriculture, the big food, big agriculture, even big tobacco, who bought all the big food companies in 1985 and started to leverage all of their nefarious wisdom as it pertains to addiction and marketing, to essentially make us addicted to maladaptive, how's that, food. So I really had to take a look at all of that stuff and then, started to like embrace more scarcity in my life. And we know that as fasting, right, in many cases. And I became very interested in the data around intermittent fasting and began to adopt that protocol, for example, like a 16-8 protocol in which I condensed my consumption of food into an 8-hour window. I started to try to live a little bit more in line with my engineering, like my hunter-gatherer ancestor, who I've dubbed Fed, John Sark, who's just my name spelled backwards. He was an opportunistic omnivore. He ate a lot of nuts and seeds and plants and occasionally on a good day, some wild game. And he didn't eat all the time. In fact, winter, when there used to be winter, provided scarcity. And, our bodies were engineered to store fat in the late summer and early fall because they got a signal from fructose, generally, to become insulin resistant and then store fat, because it knows that the scarcity and the paucity of winter's fallow is around the corner. Of course, we never have winter now in most of the modern Western world. We can just like literally order a summer squash in the middle of winter, like on our phone, any time of day. By the end of this podcast, it could be delivered at my front door. But much worse, generally we're ordering like a pizza. So winter never comes, but we are engineered for scarcity. So that was a huge one for me. It's just engineering more scarcity into my life and becoming comfortable with that level of discomfort. So that, of course, took the form of fasting, and I learned so much from fasting, so much about how it changed my physiology, but also how it changed my psychology. And then there was like a host of other physiological stressors that I began to ease my way into. Cold water therapy became a huge one for me. Resistance training, as we talked about before we started recording. My friend JJ Virgin got me doing pull-ups, 100 pull-ups a day. I couldn't do one. And that, muscle in some ways is like the greatest, most obvious example of how you can stress something and confer positive benefits, right? So you overload a bicep or whatever muscle, you tear the microfibers in there, you have enough protein and you give it enough rest, and what happens? It bounces back bigger, and more resilient and stronger. So when you self-impose just the right amount, and that's key, the dose makes the poison, just the right amount of stress, you build strength and resilience, you activate longevity pathways, and this is known kind of in medical circles as hormesis, or having sort of this hormetic response to stress, which is a sort of a positive health conferring response to short-term deliberate acute stress. So yeah, then there was a ton of other things that I slowly then got into as I started to get a handle on my health of, how can we impose stress as it pertains to human relationships, because so many of us are so socially isolated and lonely, and it's so easy now to be socially isolated. We feel as if we don't need anyone, but again, that is not how we evolved. We are not just socially wired, we are genomically wired for community. But it's so easy to eschew that. I actually created a regimen. We have a physical fitness regimen. It's like zone 2 exercise, zone 5 exercise, lifting weights. We need a social fitness regimen to address societal loneliness. So I started thinking about that. I started to think about how overwhelmingly we don't ever meet each other face to face. And then we wonder why our political dialogue is so vitriolic. But we were engineered and wired, and we evolved within situations where we didn't agree on everything, but we didn't have to be so disagreeable. So how can we lean in to more stressful, hard, thorny conversations with each other that are respectful and nonviolent and cooperative? I think we've just gotten so soft in many ways. We've relied so much on comfort and convenience that it's really kind of upended our health, not just physiologically, but psychologically and socially.
So, how do you have those stressful conversations in the way that you described it? I get how we get stronger physically. That makes so much sense, And what you're saying is get uncomfortable, be comfortable in being uncomfortable. And are you saying by doing that, I'm getting my mindset stronger too? Is that what you're saying happens?
Yes, that is what I'm saying, is that you can think of it in a way with a metaphor. Like, we build our physiological immune systems through exposure to bacteria and virus and pathogens, right? So there's a bacteria or there's a virus that enters, let's say, something that you eat, and your amazing floating brain, this immune system, senses an invader and then goes through this process of building all these proteins that we know as antibodies to essentially neuter that antigen. And the amazing thing is that these B cells have memory. So the next time you actually encounter that pathogen in the real world, you have the built-in defenses. And that's amazing, right? That's like the human immune system is just incredible. Well, there is a parallel here to building your psychological immune system. So many of us are so activated and triggerable by like something that someone says on Instagram, or like just something so benign. And then it spins us out, and we spend our whole lives in this cortisol-infused sympathetic overload state where our nervous system is literally a wreck. And then we wonder why no one gets along. Our public rhetoric is the way it is, because we're all like amygdala hijacked all the time. But what if you approached it a different way? What if you said, hey, a little bit of subjection to insult, for example, is like that pathogen where I can build my psychological immune system through a little bit of exposure to it, such that I become kind of what the Stoics called euthemic, which is this sort of unflappable, emotionally regulated state where you're disarming an insult by being unaffected by it. This doesn't excuse racism, neglect, abuse, like odious forms of abuse. But what I'm saying is just from a day-to-day perspective, I think there's a lot more that we can do to be emotionally regulate our nervous system. And then from this place of what Stephen Borges, a psychologist, called ventral vagal activation, where I'm not shut down and disassociated, but I'm also not amygdala hijacked. I'm in the middle. I'm alert, but I'm tranquil and calm, and I'm ready to engage with you. From that place, deep levels of connection can form. I started to really, really lean into this in 2020, and I won't tell you the whole backstory. I started to write this newsletter that right when we anchored into lockdown, I connected my personal email to it, and I was writing about, 2020 gave us a lot of political fodder to write about, and I was getting tremendous response from it. I think we had over 1 million people on that list. And so I get 500, 600 emails every Sunday when I would put it out, and a lot of people took issue with something that I had said. Obviously, across 2,000 words, you can have a turn of phrase that doesn't appeal to someone or offend someone in some way. My more thoughtful detractors, I started inviting them to Zoom calls. In the fall of 2020, I had 28-hour-long Zoom calls with people that didn't agree with me. It was unbelievable learning experience. And I started to learn about like Marshall Rosenberg and his whole theories around nonviolent communication. I started to learn more about Stoicism, which I referred to before. I started to apply learnings that I had gleaned from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and martial arts, and to really find ways to lean into hard, thorny, stressful conversations. I was talking with people all over the political spectrum. I was talking to people that were all the way to the left around like defund the police, et cetera, all this. I was talking to rural Trumpers that were, leading Trump rallies. I was all over the place. And the net result of this exercise was that I didn't necessarily end up agreeing with everybody, and they didn't agree with me, but I was able to make human connection with people, and it was really quite amazing. In doing so, I understood their story and their narratives and began to develop a level of compassion and empathy for them such that I could really connect with them. Now I have this like little Rolodex of frenemies, I call them. And, I text back and forth with them. I get it. I don't agree, but it's playful and it's respectful. And every once in a while, we do find common ground. And it's a really beautiful thing. It led to this project 3 weeks ago where I hosted 8 Palestinians and 8 Israelis at my retreat center in Topanga for a week. And these people came in very, very anchored, obviously, in their identity and vehemently fighting for their people. But we did, 2 to 3 days of deep, deep listening to the point where the Palestinians started telling the narratives of the Israelis, and the Israelis started telling the narratives of the Palestinians. And then from that place of human connection, we rolled up our sleeves and did 2.5 days of drafting white papers on what are we going to do with a two-state solution? What are we going to do with a confederation model? What are we going to do with the right of return? What are we going to do with the settlements? All this kind of stuff. But all that structural solution was only available to us once we had actually understood each other's narratives and found this place of deep empathy. So it's possible.
How do we influence our children to understand the importance of human connection? Because once they get a cell phone in their hands, they're gone.
Yeah. It's a good question. I have, I guess, some degree of direct experience with that. I have 3 teenage daughters. Well, my eldest is 20 now. I don't want to sell her short, but I have 3 daughters. Sure, they're on TikTok and Instagram and all that to some degree. There are tactical things that we can do in our own homes with access to internet, for example, shutting down our Wi-Fi at 9 p.m. and things like that. And there's quite a few of those things. I would say as a parent, my maxim has just generally been our kids will never listen to us, but they almost never fail to imitate us. Like so often as a parent, like I want the influence on my children to be direct and explicit. Like, I want you to meditate every morning and every night or whatever. And they're kind of like, bing, they're like, shut up, Dad. Like I'm not doing that. And then, I'll sneak into their room to like pick up the 30 glasses because we don't have any left in the cupboard. And I'll look on their phone and look, there's 2 meditation apps because they see my wife and I and the way that we live and the practices that we're dedicated to. And over time, they begin to imitate us. It's never easy when our kids are going through their teenage years, particularly right now. That's a topic of conversation that we could mine for some time, given what a lot of our children have gone through with the social isolation of COVID and then the addiction to devices, particularly girls, and then just like the ridiculous standards of beauty that we've foisted upon them, et cetera. All that said, I've seen my 20-year-old sort of get spat out the other side of that gauntlet, and she is the most thoughtful, emotionally regulated, beautiful human being. It is
By
possible.
example.
Leave footprints in the sand.
We have covered so much today, but there's so much more to talk about. So join us next week for the second part of this conversation.
Thank you for joining us on Health Gig. We loved having you with us. We hope you'll tune in again next week. In the meantime, be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast and follow us on healthgigpod.com. I'm Tricia.
And I'm Doro.
Be well.